Blog Talk Radio.
Welcome to Microphone Fiend's hip-hop radio show, live from the Bronx. This is Richard Jannaccio with my co-host, Chief 69. And our guest today is David Crowe from Rethinking AIDS. David Crowe is a special guest in this special edition, which we will be focusing on AIDS. There is a date that is coming up very shortly, April 23rd, 2014, which marks the 30th anniversary from the announcement that a virus was discovered that is the cause of the AIDS epidemic, which was also something that was constructed. David Crowe, welcome to Microphone Fiends.
Thank you for having me. It's a pleasure to be here and to give me an opportunity to get people thinking a little bit differently about the whole HIV/AIDS thing.
Let's start by telling us a little bit about yourself, the groups that you're involved with, and how you got involved with this issue to begin with.
Yeah, well, I studied science in university. I graduated in biology, and I was always, I guess, I didn't realize it till later, I was always interested in kind of the boundaries of science where we couldn't go any further. We couldn't know things. And I discovered, actually, when I was studying computer science, that even in mathematics, there's questions that you cannot answer. You can construct questions that are impossible to answer. But as humans, it offends our ego to think that there are things that we cannot know. And I was studying in a field called taxonomy, which is could be considered the dry and dusty study of which plants and animals belong to which species. Of course, now it's seen as trying to put together the evolutionary tree for species. But one of the things that fascinated me was that the quantum of taxonomy, which is the species, is itself impossible to precisely define. And you sort of have to have these ad hoc working definitions. And so there were many things about science that, these mistakes or these limits to our knowledge. Another one was the theory of continental drift, which when I was going to school in the 70s was just, recently a widely accepted theory. But prior to the 1960s, if you were a geologist, you couldn't talk about the continents moving. So how could it be that for 50 years there'd been this theory out there that the continents moved, and the science that should have studied that, geologists, absolutely refused to admit that maybe the continents move? And of course now we all know about the Ring of Fire, the continental plates, and all of those things. So what was forbidden to be discussed became a dogma within just a few years. And so when I first heard about HIV and AIDS, being a biologist, I thought, wow, this is amazing, this deadly virus that seems to come out of nowhere, targeting gay men. Then I heard, and obviously everybody knew it was a disease of immune suppression, and then I still remember somebody talking in 1987, it must have been, saying we have this new drug. And what's amazing about this drug is it's actually immunosuppressive. And we're using this immunosuppressive drug to help people with immune suppression. This is so counterintuitive. And at first I thought, wow, that's the amazing thing about science. You do these things that you think would have one effect, and they do the opposite. Now I realize...
So around 1987 was when the antenna went up, right? And the red flags.
It sort of started to, and I know that by about 1990 I'd heard that there were people who were questioning whether HIV caused AIDS, and I sort of became interested, and I learned a little bit, but there was nothing in the media, so I was kind of figuring, well, if there's nothing in the media, this probably isn't really a very solid theory. And then around 1996, I read Peter Duesberg's book, which had just come out, Inventing the AIDS Virus.
That's when I read it too.
Yeah.
And I had contacted him about the year before that, and he sent me materials in the mail, and I think one of the materials he sent me was a chapter from his forthcoming book.
Yeah.
So when it came out, I read the entire book.
Yeah, I read it, and it was, to me, it was like this this detective novel. But when I got to the end of it, I thought, you could argue with any one thing in this book, and maybe he's wrong on some things, but he actually only has to be right on one of his major points, and he had about 100 in the book, that the HIV/AIDS dogmatists have a real problem. Is it the fact that it doesn't behave like a sexually transmitted disease? Is it the fact that the evidence that the virus is present is only in such small quantities it's hard to understand how it could be causing disease? Is it the fact that the drugs, the drug I mentioned in 1987 is the drug called AZT, is it a problem that the drugs can cause immunosuppression? And even in the literature of the drug itself, it sort of, in a rather roundabout way, says this drug can cause AIDS. It says the side effects of this drug are difficult to distinguish from the progression of the disease, which is a fancy way of saying this drug can cause the symptoms of the disease. It can cause AIDS.
Okay, this is a very complicated issue, and we're going to have to take things one thing at a time, otherwise we're going to lose people. So let's start off by telling us a little bit about Rethinking AIDS, the group Rethinking AIDS, of which you are the president.
Yeah, I'm the president of Rethinking AIDS, happening since 2008. I was not around at the beginning of Rethinking AIDS. In the early 1990s, a few very prestigious scientists got together and tried to get a letter written in a major journal saying, we, a group of 15 scientists or something like that, we question whether it really has been established that HIV is the cause of AIDS, and we as a group want to reopen the scientific discussion around this point. And they got the runaround for a long time. I think they eventually did get this letter published, but it was extremely difficult in getting any real science that questioned the HIV/AIDS theory became virtually impossible. And there's some actually really interesting examples of scientific censorship that have happened even quite recently around that. So this group slowly grew. The people who were in it knew that the group was not going to, the need for the group was going to be a long-term need. And so people like Professor Duesberg that you mentioned became involved with Rethinking AIDS, and he's still on the board.
Peter Duesberg from the University of California, Berkeley.
Yeah, he was one of the top retrovirologists in the 1980s. He was considered one of the top. Retrovirus is what HIV is supposed to be. HIV is a retrovirus, supposedly. So he studies those things, and he was considered one of the world's top experts in retrovirology up till 1987. The same year as AZT was approved, he wrote a paper saying retroviruses cannot cause disease. They live harmoniously with their host, and they only survive as long as their host does. So they have no incentive to cause disease, and there's no evidence that they do cause disease. So he's been on the board, I believe, for the entire duration of the organization. Christian Fiala is a gynecologist, MD from Austria, and he's worked a lot in Africa and in Thailand, and he's seen a lot of the contradictions about what people were saying about Africa and what's actually been happening in Africa.
Well, there are more than 3,000 signatories now to this, correct? And
yes, I maintain.
And they're mostly what you would, if you describe them, they would be scientists, physicians, science and medical writers. Give us a description of these.
There's a petition which anybody can sign, which started with this letter in the early 1990s, and basically the petition says, we believe that there are questions about whether HIV causes AIDS, and the whole issue should be reopened and rediscussed. And I maintain a second list where I add people to my list if they have some educational or life accomplishments. And the reason for that is not to say that people who have a PhD have more right to have an opinion, but to counter the claim that's often made that only a few wackos think that HIV doesn't cause AIDS. So the people on my list includes a lot of PhDs and MDs, alternative medical practitioners, and sometimes we're criticized because we have chiropractors on there. We also include authors, journalists, mathematicians, engineers, lawyers, basically anybody who you normally would say in real life, this person has been through multiple years of schooling, or they've done something significant in their life, makes me want to take what they say seriously. And we have...
I noticed that President Mbeki from South Africa is on the list.
Yeah, he was
So I guess you could have, political leaders and heads of state.
Yeah, of course, most politicians, before they have an opinion, they do a poll. And if you do a poll on AIDS, then you know which way the wind's blowing. And maybe it's not the public opinion that's as important as where's the money coming from. It's the currents of money that are most important. And most politicians realize that there's tons of money if you have an AIDS program. The money floods in, and of course, if you're a corrupt politician, which is almost goes without saying, some of it's going to stick to your fingers. And Africa in particular has become a great experimental ground for, use of all of these toxic drugs that are called AIDS therapies, apart from the gay and black communities in America.
Okay, so what I'd like to do now is we're going to take out a moment to listen to the speech made by the U.S. Secretary of Health and Human Services, Margaret Heckler, on April 23rd, 1984, which started it all. And then I'm going to ask you to quickly, like in a minute and a half or so, go through the chain of events that occurred over the last few decades from that point on that probably wouldn't have happened if it were not for this so-called announced discovery of a virus that caused AIDS. Let's take a listen to that.
Okay.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. First, the probable cause of AIDS has been found, a variant of a known human cancer virus. Second, not only has the agent been identified, but a new process has been developed to mass produce this virus. Thirdly, with discovery of both the virus and this new process, we now have a blood test for AIDS. With the blood test, we can identify AIDS victims with essentially 100% certainty.
Thank you, Secretary.
There it is.
Yeah, and she was
the announcement that started it all.
Yes. She was introducing a man named Robert Gallo, who was a very a scientist who really wanted to go places. He wanted to win the Nobel Prize, and of course, discovering the cause of AIDS seemed like a no-brainer. The discoverer would get the Nobel Prize. The whole thing fell apart because it became very clear that Robert Gallo had expropriated significant materials from the Pasteur Institute in France, and it was actually the discoveries, whatever they were probably made at the Pasteur Institute in France by a man named Luc Montagnier and the people working for him. And many people, few people are aware of this controversy, that Robert Gallo's record as an honest scientist is in tatters, and if you don't believe this, you need to read John Crutzen's book, Science Fiction's The Dark Legacy of Robert Gallo, which was published in the early 2000s, and goes through in gory detail, what Robert Gallo did in terms of changing his notebooks after investigations began, all the investigations and how findings of scientific fraud were derailed at the last minute by sort of government involvement. So really, if you're knowledgeable about science, you really have to rely on Luc Montagnier. But Luc Montagnier has said over the years, consistently, since the very beginning, almost since the very beginning, he has said things that contradict the mainstream dogma that HIV is the sole cause of AIDS. He's first of all said that cofactors are necessary, that other things other than HIV are necessary to cause AIDS. He's said quite clearly that a strong immune system can throw HIV out of the body very quickly. He's called AIDS a disease of oxidative stress, and he's actually promoted an antioxidant made from fermented papaya. He's been the author of several books. He doesn't always join the dots, but he does talk about AIDS being a disease of oxidative stress, and he does promote antioxidants to cure diseases of oxidative stress, and you can leave it up to your imagination that he would feel that his products could, reverse whatever AIDS is. He's also admitted...
let's backtrack a little bit.
Yes.
This announcement was made, and at the time there was no paper published in a scientific journal, and
right.
Montagnier was not even mentioned, but what actually had happened, it turned out later on that Gallo had received a sample of virus from Montagnier sent over from France, which scientists do exchange things, and he said, hey, I found the virus, but actually he didn't find it. He was using the virus that had been sent to him from Montagnier, and now Montagnier later was saying that cofactors may be needed, and not the virus by itself could cause AIDS, and also that people could use their immune systems would fight the virus, and not everybody who was infected would come down with AIDS.
Yeah.
And in addition, right?
Yeah.
And in addition to that, the other thing that we just heard here is that when this announcement was made, they had already prepared a test, and they said that the virus could be produced in mass quantity. Isn't that a little bit unusual?
Well, the sequence of events was that first they patented the production of the virus and the HIV antibody test. This was done before they announced anything in a press conference, and this was done before any scientific papers were published. Now,
but they're also saying that it's the probable cause, right? They're not saying it's the cause. They're saying it's the probable cause, and yet they've already developed the test to test for it.
Yes, and they're saying
strikes me as very strange.
The test is close to 100% accurate, which they're still saying, even though it's an antibody test, it is not a test for a virus. But another thing that happened, again, was that Luc Montagnier had previously submitted a patent application to the U.S. Patent Office, and it basically got lost. But Robert Gallo's patent application, because he was highly connected in the U.S. government, was approved in record time, and there was not any consideration given to the prior art of another patent application the Patent Office already had. So there was some real monkey business that went on at the highest levels of the U.S. government. But again, you can get lost into as a friend of mine used to say, who stole the fake jewels? Because did Luc Montagnier really have a virus? One thing I was going to say is that Luc Montagnier admitted on film in the 1990s that he was never able to purify HIV. And it's quite clear that Robert Gallo never purified HIV. And in 1997, two separate groups of scientists published electron microscope pictures of what had previously been assumed to be pure virus, and they documented that it was more than 90% impurities. So to this day, the virus HIV has never been purified, and there's a much bigger question about whether HIV even exists, and what are the HIV tests testing for?
Well, if the virus hasn't been purified, then the proteins that you're using for the test may not be from the virus. Isn't that logical?
That's right. I mean, the way to produce an antibody test, the proper way would be to first purify the virus, and then you know that in your sample, if you look under an electron microscope and all you see is the same particles, you know that any proteins in that sample came from the virus. So you take a portion of the sample which you didn't use under the electron microscope, and you extract those proteins, and then you react human blood with those proteins to produce antibodies. And that would be a way to get antibodies, which are antibodies to whatever you're seeing under the microscope. But if you take 90% impure material, and the impurities are mostly cells that come from a cell culture that have nothing to do with the person you're testing for, and if you develop a test based on that, you're basically testing, do people's bodies react to this cell culture? And what you might be testing is how hyperactivated is somebody's immune system. So in other words, if somebody's been doing intravenous drugs or something like that that's messed up their immune system, they might react on the test, whereas a normal person wouldn't, a normal person.
Chief, do you have any questions?
Yeah, I just want to say, hey, what's up? To our guest. I'm the co-host.
Oh, I'm very pleased to meet you.
I've just been listening and soaking up all the information. I'm not a scientific or medical researcher by any means. I'm just a young hip-hop practitioner. My question is, has there been anyone who possibly in any part of the world in the past and maybe in recent years who were diagnosed with HIV or AIDS without, this anything to prove it?
Well, I'm not exactly sure what you're asking, but I have a friend who's a hemophiliac, and his people, older people like me who remember back to the 80s, hemophiliacs who have to get blood transfusions or blood product infusions on a regular basis so that their blood will clot. He was diagnosed in either 1987 or 1988. He doesn't remember exactly the date. He's still healthy. He's never taken AIDS drugs. And he feels like the HIV theory has destroyed his life because it's impossible to have a normal sex life if you're HIV positive. Men can get thrown in jail for 10 or 20 years if they have sex without revealing their HIV status. And even if they do reveal their HIV status, if their sexual partner says that they didn't, then they're probably going to go to jail anyway. So they're very vulnerable. But yes, this man and several like him rejected the HIV theory back then. They did not take AZT, which was the only drug available at the time he was diagnosed. And they watched their fellow hemophiliacs or fellow gay men die, and they remained healthy. So there are a number of people like this. But it's very difficult for them to find a forum to bring this forward because they can't talk to doctors because doctors get very antagonistic when they meet these people. They're always pushing these people to go on the drugs.
Yeah.
And so they've been kind of silenced.
Does that answer your question, or do you have a follow-up?
Well, I think this throws my mind in many directions.
See, I understood the question differently, but I understand the answer.
Maybe I didn't answer it right.
I think that answer was good, though, too.
Yeah, it was, but I thought you were asking whether or not somebody had been diagnosed with AIDS without being properly tested.
Yeah, that was what I was asking. But I think
yes,
which is a separate issue, but also both equally important.
Very related, yeah.
The actual definition of AIDS allows people with AIDS to be diagnosed as not having AIDS. And let me try to explain that. I think the first organ transplant was in the 1960s, and most original organ transplants failed because the human immune system would reject any organ that it saw as foreign. So they had to invent immunosuppressive drugs. And there was such a drug that was in use in the 1970s in order to suppress the immune system so that transplants would not be rejected. It was of a class of drugs which is called nucleoside analogs, and this will become important later. And this drug caused many of the side effects that we would currently cause AIDS. And so the symptoms of immunosuppression from this drug were very similar to AIDS. And so the original AIDS definition said if you are on immunosuppressive drugs, you do not have AIDS, no matter what your symptoms are. So you could have the exact same symptoms as, gay man in 1981, but if you were in line for kidney transplant and you were on these immunosuppressive drugs, then you would not be classified as AIDS.
Yeah.
But other causes of immune suppression, such as severe malnutrition, were not included on the list of things that would not be considered AIDS. So somebody in Africa who's severely malnourished, who might be immune suppressed because of their malnourishment, would be considered an AIDS victim. But there was another strange thing in the definition, too, that it said if you have certain diseases, even if you have a negative HIV test, you can still be diagnosed with AIDS. So they were diagnosing people with AIDS, claiming that their HIV test was 100% accurate or close to it, as Margaret Heckler said in that little piece of tape. And yet, if they wanted to, if you had Kaposi's sarcoma, this skin cancer that was very closely related with early AIDS cases, or a type of pneumonia, they could say, you've got AIDS even though your HIV test was negative. So there's a lot of contradictions buried in the very definition of HIV and AIDS.
Okay. I guess my follow-up question is, as far as the treatment from the early 80s to today, is there anything aside from the AZT that they're using to profit or manipulate with?
Well, that's a really excellent question. They are still using AZT. It's not as popular because it went off patent a few years ago, and so it's nowhere near as profitable. I mentioned that this immunosuppressive drug for organ transplants was what's called a nucleoside analog, and AZT is also a nucleoside analog, which means that one of the side effects will be immunosuppression. And even if you're not using AZT, if you're taking a cocktail of AIDS drugs...
I don't know if people know what a nucleoside analog is, but basically it terminates the chain of the genetic material as it's being duplicated. Isn't that what it really means?
Every time a cell in your body divides, so if your hair is growing, if your body is producing new blood cells, if your toenails are growing, if your muscles are replenishing themselves, if your intestinal cells are growing, any cell in your body that's growing, if it encounters a molecule of AZT or another nucleoside analog, has a chance of being killed or worse, turned into a cancerous cell or some kind of deformed cell that could cause problems in your body. And so the nucleoside analogs... Yep.
Aren't these being used today in combination? As they may have one name, but there's the combination of drugs with protease inhibitors and the original nucleoside analogs.
Well, there's a whole bunch of nucleoside analogs. Like the second one came out in 1991 called DDI. There's now about 20 nucleoside analogs, but every cocktail of AIDS drugs, which is usually 3 or 4 drugs, contains usually 2 nucleoside analogs, at least one, usually 2. I think there are some that only have 1. And so even today, this original class of drugs that was invented in 1987 that is incredibly toxic is still, at lower doses, is still in every AIDS cocktail. Now, around 1996, they added what they called miracle drugs, which were the protease inhibitors, which are considerably less toxic. And so the toxicity of AIDS cocktails has gone down because the amount of nucleoside analog in the drugs has gone down and because the protease inhibitors are not as toxic. But they do cause fat redistribution in your body. There's a phenomenon called buffalo hump where you get this lump of fat on your back while your legs get wasted. And your
right
face
on the back
wasted.
of your neck usually, right?
Yes,
Could
yes.
be,
It's very unsightly, and it's combined with your face losing fat, so you look horrible, and it's really bad for the feelings of the self-image of people who are classified as AIDS. They really feel like they're a freak when they look at themselves in the mirror because their body has become misshapen by the drugs. The drugs also cause liver failure, kidney failure, severe bone weakening, which can even in one case I read a paper where it caused the spine to fracture and caused paralysis. So these drugs still have really debilitating side effects, and some people are affected more than others.
But the lethal effects are what, the liver and the kidney?
Well, there's quite a few lethal effects, but definitely the liver failure, that really started in the 1990s with the protease inhibitors, and kidney failure seems to be more common with some of the newer drugs. That warnings about kidney failure are more common with the newer drugs, many of which are produced by a company called Gilead, which is who had on its board, I don't know if he's still there, a man that everybody's familiar with, Donald Rumsfeld, the man who brought us the Iraq War, the man who brought us aspartame, also was involved with this,
equal the sweetener,
Yes, is also involved with this company called Gilead, which I think is a biblical reference. And they are now sort of the top, or at least the most fastest growing AIDS drug company, and probably the first big American AIDS drug company, because before that there was a British and German company that were producing a lot of AIDS drugs. And now I think Gilead is doing a lot more. They're very well connected, which probably means that when American money goes overseas to buy AIDS drugs for poor Africans or whatever, there's a much greater chance that it's going to be Gilead drugs that are being used.
As you mentioned earlier, there are some very prominent scientists who have questioned the theory that HIV causes AIDS, or whether or not it even exists. One of them is Dr. Kary Mullis, who is a Nobel laureate and who invented actually one of the procedures that is now being used as an AIDS test called the viral load test, and we'll get to that later. But he himself denies that HIV causes AIDS, and let's listen to what he had to say.
Yeah.
The first time I really questioned it, I was working on a project where we were measuring HIV in people's blood at this place called Specialty Laboratories in Santa Monica. I was just a consultant there. And I came in about 3 days a month, and we were working on that. And at some point, we needed to re-up our grant from the NIH to work on that, and I had to write it. And so the first line of that was, HIV is the probable cause of AIDS. And I wrote that, and then I said, well, I need a paper, some kind of scientific paper, to reference that statement, because when you make a statement like that, that's like a fact. You need to say, here's how come I know that, right? You put a little 1 if it's the first statement you've made, and then you put down at the bottom of the paper, you have a 1, and you say, here's a paper by somebody that describes why that statement is true, right? And so I said, well, what's that? I don't know. Let me think about, what is that paper? Who do I go to for that? And I looked around. I asked a couple of virologists at that company, and they said, no, you don't have to reference. I said, I have to reference that because I don't know where that came from. How do I know that? And it turned out that nobody knew it. There wasn't a scientific reference, like a paper that somebody had submitted with like experimental data in it and like logical discussion and said, here's how come we know that HIV is the probable cause of AIDS. There was nothing out there like that. Nothing.
That was Dr. Kary Mullis, Nobel laureate and inventor of the PCR test. Your comment, David?
PCR is not a test. It's an important
Well,
detail.
It's being used as a test, right, for viral load.
Yeah, PCR is a way of duplicating DNA, and so it's a manufacturing technique. And if you say you have a piece of DNA that produces insulin, and you want to put that into bacteria so that you can produce synthetic insulin, then what you want to do is to take your one piece of DNA that you've produced in some way, and you want to produce 1 million copies of it. And so PCR was an automated mechanism where in a day or two you could take that one piece of DNA and get your 1 million pieces, which you could then use to manufacture artificial insulin or something like that. And so it is being used as a testing technology, but it is very dangerous to use a manufacturing technique like that as a testing technology. And the best analogy I can come with is, because it is what's known as an exponential algorithm, it's like taking the size of the blast of a nuclear bomb and estimating from that how much nuclear material you started with. The problem is that any errors in the first few steps are multiplied exponentially. So if you're not very good at making a nuclear bomb, you may produce a much, much smaller mushroom cloud with the same amount of material. Somebody who's extremely sophisticated and has a very efficient, initial fusion will produce a much bigger mushroom cloud with the same amount of material. And what they're trying to do with the PCR as a test is they're trying to look at the end result, which is kind of like the mushroom cloud, and go back to the very beginning and saying, okay, this must be how much material was in your body. And that's what's known as your viral load, which some people think is a count of the number of particles of the HIV virus in your body. Is nothing of the kind. It is manufacturing from DNA that's in your body that's not even proven to be within a virus.
Well, it sounds like it can't possibly be accurate because we already said before that the HIV has not been purified, and if it's not purified, then anything that's in there with it can multiply as well, all the impurities.
Yeah, that's true, and you don't even know for sure that the DNA you're looking for actually comes from HIV because you took it from impure materials. So it could be DNA that came from an abnormal cell of some kind. There could be a lot of different reasons why it's multiplied, and there's never been widespread testing of the general population who are HIV antibody negative with the viral load test. The suspicion is because it's such a sensitive test that a significant portion of HIV negative people would have a detectable viral load, and that would cause the whole accuracy of the test into question. So when you submit blood for both antibody testing and viral load testing, they will normally do the antibody testing first, and if it's negative, they will not do the viral load testing. So they never find out if antibody negative people have a measurable viral load. But as of last Friday, there's been a big new development which appears to allow a viral load test, which is not approved for diagnosis by the FDA. They appear to have allowed this viral load test to be used to diagnose HIV infection on its own. And given that it's hypersensitive, I believe that this is going to result in a huge number of false positives. And people are going to do an antibody test afterwards if they're suspicious, and they're going to find out that they're HIV antibody negative. But by this time, they may have already been put on AIDS drugs or panicked and had their life turned upside down.
Yeah, I have a question. As far as that original sample that Gallo had received, does it still exist? Is there a way that these scientific researchers could look at that sample to see what it is that the test is actually based on?
That's an excellent question, and I don't know if that still exists. But an interesting fact about that original sample is, my understanding is that Montagnier took his sample from a gay man with swollen lymph nodes, not somebody with AIDS. And there was no follow-up to see if this person developed AIDS later. So the sample may have come from somebody who had a minor inflammation causing swollen lymph nodes, a minor infection or something like that, and never actually did have AIDS. But they did manage to do these tricks in the laboratory that they interpreted as the presence of a virus. But I don't know if that material still exists and whether, how you would get a hold of it so scientists who knew how to, do these experiments could attempt to grow and purify a virus from it.
Yeah.
Well, another confounding fact is that Gallo used Montagnier's sample because he couldn't produce one himself, and in fact, nobody's been able to duplicate that.
Yeah, we really can't trust what Gallo wrote, but even Gallo himself in his original papers in May of 1984, as I said, they came out after the press conference, which was in April 23rd. Gallo's papers said that we were able to culture the virus from less than 50% of the people we had decided had AIDS. They got antibody results from about 90% of the people that they claimed had AIDS, but they were only able to culture the virus. Now, culturing a virus is considered to be a better technique than the antibody tests, but they didn't say, well, what that must mean is that the antibody tests are only accurate half the time, that half the time they're registering people who don't actually have the virus. They said, well, obviously there's a problem with culturing, and our antibody test is 100% accurate. But that was based on their desire for it to be accurate, because you could commercialize an antibody test, but virus culturing was a very tedious, expensive, slow process, and so you couldn't diagnose millions of people with culturing. It just wouldn't be practical. But antibody tests are very, very cheap and simple.
Now, I understand that although Gallo was the head of the lab, the person who actually did the work had a different report, and then Gallo scratched it out and made changes in it. Could you tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah, a guy named Popovich was the head of the lab. So Gallo was the the scientist, the big shot, but he wasn't in the lab day to day. Popovich ran the lab. So Popovich was, 9 to 5, 5 days a week in the lab, probably on weekends as well. And he was in charge of writing this seminal paper on HIV. So Gallo was on vacation or on a conference or something, and he came back and he got this draft of the paper, and Popovich was trying to be honest, and he said, we found something interesting, it deserves further investigation, but he was kind of vague about, he didn't want to say things that he couldn't prove. He didn't want to stretch the truth. So Gallo basically scratched whole chunks of it out, and he said things like, this is not what should be in a seminal scientific paper. So basically, Gallo had not been doing the experiments hands-on. He basically rewrote it to make it look like it was much better than it was. So it became a very political document. The reason why we have this scratched-out copy of Popovich's paper is because Popovich was very aware that there were some really shady things going in the lab, and so he sent a copy of this paper to his sister, who I believed lived in the Czech Republic or something, to protect himself in case there was any legal investigations later, and there were. And so to protect himself, Popovich brought this paper back to say, this is what I wrote. I didn't say these things. It was Robert Gallo who amped it up to make it sound like this was a scientific breakthrough, not me. But Popovich still got punished worse than Robert Gallo. But that's the way the world works these days, that people with power have a different set of rules, as we've seen with bankers or any other powerful group.
Now, suppose I was approached and asked to undergo an HIV test. What would I learn if I demanded to read the package inserts before taking the test?
Well,
and you can do it for each of the ELISA test, the Western blot.
Yes. Well, up till last Friday, basically the standard in places like America and Canada was that you would do 2 what are known as ELISA antibody tests, and if they were both positive, sometimes you do 3 and take 2 out of 3, something like that, but you do 2 or 3 antibody tests, and if you got 2 of them to be positive, you would then go on and do another antibody test known as the Western blot. And so you're verifying, validating an antibody test with another antibody test. And if you read, for example, the Abbott antibody test label, it says, this test was designed to be extremely sensitive. As a result, non-specific reactions may be seen in samples from some people who, for example, due to prior pregnancy, blood transfusion, or other exposure, have antibodies to the human cells or media in which the HIV is grown for the manufacture of this test. So this is what I was saying earlier. Because these test materials are not pure, they're not made from purified virus, if you react to some of the human cells in the cell culture, then you could get a positive reaction to those cells and not to HIV, if there is even any HIV in it. And if you look at all the test inserts, they all have this kind of statement that basically says this test alone cannot prove HIV infection. And even the confirmatory test, known as usually the Western blot, says this test alone cannot detect HIV infection. And this is also
what
true
about the notion that if I take my test results and I fly, I'm given a positive test result, and I fly to another country and I hand it to the doctor, I might end up with a negative result. How does that work?
Yeah, well, the ELISA test is a single dot that changes color, and the intensity of the color tells you whether you're positive or not. So it's an arbitrary amount of color change. If the color change is more than a certain amount, it's considered positive. The Western blot is a more sophisticated test where they take what they believe to be HIV proteins and they spread them out on a long strip. And then they can see whether your blood's reacting with one or more of these proteins. And somebody a while ago did some research on this, and they found at least 10 different methods of interpreting a Western blot.
We're back live from the Bronx. Welcome to Microphone Fiends Hip Hop Radio Show, our special edition focusing on AIDS with the 30th anniversary of the announcement that a virus had been found and declared to be the probable cause of the syndrome known as AIDS. And we're here with David Crowe from Rethinking AIDS. And David,
hi again.
We were just talking about the various tests, but if people get all of these tests and everyone comes back positive, what is likely to happen next? What kind of advice are they going to be given, and what does the test really mean?
Well, there's a second test that is very important. So if you test HIV positive, and let's say that it was routine testing, so you had no symptoms at the time, you will be under some pressure to take drugs. And the first way to amp up that pressure is to get you to do what they call a CD4 immune cell count. And if your CD4 count is below 500 or particularly below 200, then you will be under pressure to take drugs. Under 200, in the United States alone, you will get an automatic diagnosis of AIDS if you're HIV positive. Whereas in HIV-negative people, the CD4 count is generally ignored. So an HIV-negative person can walk around with a CD4 count of 0 and nobody thinks anything of it. But if you're an HIV-positive person and you have a CD4 count of 499, your doctor is going to be putting you under pressure to take the drugs. And if you're under 200, it's going to be very difficult to resist. And you will be classified by the Centers for Disease Control as an AIDS case, even if you have no illnesses whatsoever. And in fact, the majority of people in America diagnosed with AIDS since 1997 have been in the category of a positive HIV test, a low CD4 count, and no AIDS-defining illness.
You mentioned CD4 counts. Let's explain to our listeners what that means. Most of us know that our blood contains a liquid portion called plasma and two types of cells, red blood cells and white blood cells. Now, the red blood cells contain hemoglobin, which carries oxygen to all parts of our body. The white blood cells function as our immune system to fight bacteria, viruses, and other foreign invaders. Now, there are many different types of white blood cells, different sizes, different shapes, different functions, and they work in different ways to protect us from disease. One type of white blood cell is called CD4, named in 1984 after a glycoprotein found on its surface. So when a blood sample is taken, the different cells can be counted, and a CD4 count then tells us how many of these CD4 type cells you have in a milliliter of blood that was taken from you. So in other words, if it's 500, then it means you have 500 CD4 cells in a milliliter of blood. The normal range is stated to be 500 to 1500. But some people have 0 detected and seem to be healthy. So where does this normal range come from? It is believed that HIV kills the CD4 cells. That's the theory. But it's more of a religion than a science. Where's the proof? Nonetheless, as you just told us, David, if someone tests HIV positive and also has a CD4 count below 200, they will be diagnosed with AIDS and prescribed antiviral drug combinations called cocktails, although they may look and feel perfectly healthy. Continue.
Different things. The CD4 count is supposed to tell you the health of your immune system. And according to graphs you can see all over the internet, that your CD4 count will start well over 500 when you're first infected, and it will gradually fall until after about 10 years it will hit 0 and you will die. That's what's shown by these graphs. Now, I was able to show by going to the sources of these graphs that the vast majority of these graphs are actually imaginary. That if you go back to the original paper, it says, this is an illustration of how HIV and AIDS works. It's not based on data. It's based on the imagination of the person who drew the graph. And if you actually find graphs of real CD4 counts in real people who are HIV positive, you find that they don't make any real pattern. You have people whose CD4 counts go up over time, some go down, some stay stable. There's no discernible pattern amongst HIV positive people when their CD4 counts are measured, but it's used very effectively as if it was almost magic. I was in a doctor's office, and she said, when you hit 200, you will get Kaposi's sarcoma, and when you hit 100, you will get PCP pneumonia, and when you hit 0, you will die. But I was just talking to a guy the other day whose CD4 counts are essentially 0, and he stopped his drugs, and he's been healthier since he stopped the drugs. So what are they going to say to him?
I don't know, but Kaposi's sarcoma is very rare, and it really is associated, isn't it, associated with the drugs, poppers, amyl nitrates?
Different groups of
people.
Let's
go back to before HIV, right? I mean, before, or HTLV3, as it was called back then. Poppers were considered prime suspect.
Right. So for people who are not gay, they might not know what poppers are, but if you're a gay man, it's almost certain that you know what poppers are, because even today, these drugs are rampant amongst gay men, but they're not generally used amongst the heterosexual community. There's some use, but it's not big. Poppers are an inhalant, and they're a powerful muscle relaxant, and they've been shown to be carcinogenic and immunosuppressive. The two original AIDS diseases were Kaposi's sarcoma, which is a cancer, and PCP pneumonia, which is a disease of severely immune-suppressed people. And some people, and this is not all gay men by any means, there were a few gay men who became essentially addicted to poppers and who would use them almost continuously. And you found these relatively foul-smelling chemicals. I've never smelled them, but I've heard them described as smelling like a dirty locker room or old running shoes or something like that. They don't really have a nice smell, but they're sold as room deodorizers with homoerotic names, like Iron Horse and things that are obvious references to male sexuality. So these, quote, room deodorizers or video head cleaners, they were also sold as. Everybody knows, nudge, nudge, wink, wink, that they're actually a party drug for gay men. And there were some gay men who said, look, these drugs are dangerous, and we should be telling our fellow gay men that they're dangerous and encouraging them not to use them. And they were pushed aside by the monetary interests, both of the producers of the poppers and, of course, the drug companies who wanted to sell AZT to the gay community. So it was much better for everybody from a financial perspective to say, okay, HIV is causing all these problems, poppers are innocent, and what gay men is to add AZT to their poppers, and that's what's going to make them healthy. Didn't work.
So not only were people given ineffective treatment, but they were not realizing that they were doing something that was harmful to themselves.
Yeah, I mean, AZT goes way beyond ineffective. The original doses of AZT were 1,500 milligrams a day, which is a huge dosage of an active chemical. Now the dosages of AZT, if it's given at all, is around 200 milligrams. So it's like 1/7, 1/8 of what was given back then. And it killed a lot of people. So those pictures that you have of a man lying in bed, totally wasted, that could be produced solely by the impact of AZT. That's not to say that some people didn't have other reasons for being unhealthy, such as a really bad recreational drug use habit or other things like that. But AZT by itself could cause somebody to look like an AIDS victim. And the label of the drug, remarkably, the label of the drug actually says that if you bury into the fine print.
Okay. Now, we also have a drug called Truvada, comprised of 2 drugs, which is approved for use by HIV-negative individuals to prevent HIV infection. That's the claim. And the official use is for people who are at high risk, but it is supposed to be used with condoms. But in the popular press and culture, and even infomercials, it's a drug that is taken so that you can engage in unprotected sex. Then there's also the contradiction that if you use condoms, why would you be at high risk? And why would you need this drug? Also, you're supposed to test frequently. And the minute you turn HIV positive, you have to switch to stronger drugs. Because Truvada then becomes a villain by allowing resistant strains of HIV to emerge. This is all in the FDA literature, but that's not practical. HIV-positive people will still be taking this drug, and they'll be doing it for a while before they find out their status. So by their own claims, if you believe in the HIV theory, it is totally irresponsible to use these drugs. It's repeating the same fallacy as occurred and still occurs with antibiotics. That's overuse leading to resistant strains. If treating an HIV-negative person with antivirals is not overuse, I don't know what is. Talk about Truvada, the antiviral drug combination for HIV-negative, not positive, uninfected, healthy, HIV-negative individuals.
So what they want is to have men who are at risk, supposedly, so in other words, gay men, to be taking Truvada as a preventive. So if your boyfriend is HIV positive, you can take Truvada and you don't have to worry about it. That's sort of like the message in the media. Now, I should point out that Truvada is a combination of 2 drugs, emtricitabine and tenofovir, which are both produced by Gilead, which is a drug company that I mentioned earlier.
Right.
And if you go to their own website, which is start.truvada.com, you will see there that it lists the side effects of this drug: lactic acidosis, which is where your blood becomes acid, and this is a potentially fatal condition; liver disease, including liver failure; worsening of hepatitis B virus; kidney disease, including kidney failure; bone disease, which I was talking about earlier, like severe weakening of bones; fat redistribution, this is like buffalo hump or whatever; something called immune reconstitution disorder. And so this is basically any disease that occurs after you start AIDS drugs is blamed on the strengthening of your immune system. So without an immune system, your body can't fight off diseases, so it can't produce things like fevers. So if after you start AIDS drugs, you start to get fevers, inflammation, things like that, they say, your immune system's coming back, your troublesome immune system. So it's not the fault of the drugs at all, it's the fault of your immune system. They also cause diarrhea and nausea and a number of other side effects. It also says that if you take these drugs for prevention, like if you read the mainstream media, you'd think, okay, I pop a Truvada every day, I have a ton of sexual partners, life's wonderful, I don't have to worry about anything now that I'm taking this pill. But it says you must practice safe sex, you must not miss a single dose of this drug, and you must have fewer sex partners. So basically, if HIV is a transmissible disease and you consistently use condoms, why do you need to take Truvada? But they have enough caveats in there, and they know that most people are not going to read this. Most people are not going to read these side effects. If you read the mainstream media, you will not hear a whisper about side effects for Truvada, but the drug company is smarter. They put on their website, they put these side effects on their website. So if you take Truvada and you come down with liver failure, don't go back to the drug company and tell them that they didn't tell you, because they did tell you. You just didn't read the fine print. And that's what they're relying on. They're relying on people being panicked into taking this drug, and then when something bad happens, they're going to say, well, we're really sorry, but, there's HIV or liver failure. Which did you want? You chose liver failure. So have a nice day, but don't come to us for compensation.
In the 1990s, there was a big push to get pregnant women to be tested. Where did that go as far as, the different states had to do this individually in some cases, and how does it stand today?
Well, not too many states actually make it mandatory. Not too many states have a law. There may be 2 or 3 that have a law that says it's mandatory for pregnant women to be tested. But they effectively have made it mandatory everywhere. And the way it works is like this. If you as a mother are told that you're to be HIV tested and you refuse, that is considered proof that you are HIV positive. And that the reason why you don't want to be tested is because you don't want to give AZT to your child. That's basically the only drug that is given for the prevention of mother-to-child transmission of HIV. So the very act of refusing an HIV test proves to the doctor that you're a non-compliant mother. And so then what they will say is, well, you have to give AZT to your child, because if you don't get HIV tested, we're going to assume that you're HIV positive.
Wow.
And if you refuse to give AZT to your child, they will seize your child. And in England, in one case, they actually got a court order where they got custody of a child who was not yet born. And so at the moment of birth, they basically took the child away at that moment. And I don't think there's anything crueler to a human being than to take a child away from a mother at or around the time of birth, because the biological bond between mother and child is intense. And to break that, forcibly break that, is devastating to mothers. And then to tell the mother that you are going to give a drug that is a nucleoside analog, that interferes with DNA synthesis, that interferes with growing cells, when your infant is full of cells that are wildly growing, because the only way the child can grow is if the cells in the body grow, if the bones grow and the muscles grow, and everything in your body has to grow when you're young. Things that no longer grow when you're an adult are growing when you're a child. And so AZT is like, they call it a nuke, and it's like these little nuclear bombs that are going off in your body. Some of them may cause cancer, some of them may cause deformities. It's terrible.
Do we have any information about the fetuses that were treated this way?
Yeah, there is.
After they're born, what's their scenario?
Well, of course, they blame everything on HIV. So the doctors will say that these children, sure, they have a lot of problems, but they're HIV positive. So what do you expect? These are all symptoms of HIV. But there was some animal research done on monkeys in, I don't know if it was in the 80s or early 90s, and it showed quite conclusively that you can cause birth defects and cancers in monkeys by giving them AZT. And there was no mainstream attention for this research, but it's documented in the scientific literature. You can go find it. I've made a lot of this information available on my website, araf.ab.ca. Long lists of scientific information, including the dangers of AZT.
Aside from that, about 20 years ago or so, Dr. Peter Duesberg, who we spoke about earlier, he actually saved the life of a Romanian baby that was adopted by an American couple here. Tell us about that.
Yeah, well, it was around 1990, and this couple wanted to adopt a child, and they chose to adopt a Romanian orphan. The Romanian orphanages were notorious hellholes, and at the fall of the communist era at the end of the 80s, I guess, I guess Romania was opening up a little bit and probably trying to get rid of its orphans as well. So this couple from Minnesota went over to get the baby, and as part of the process of getting the baby was HIV tested in Romania, tested negative, came back to the United States and tested positive. The doctor said, your only hope is to put the baby on AZT. So they went through about 2 years of hell. The baby had continuous muscle cramps, cried, wouldn't eat, wasn't growing properly. It was a total nightmare, and they were basically preparing for the death of this baby that they had decided to love and to bring up. And then I think the grandfather or something said, there's this Dr. Peter Duesberg who's said that nobody should take AZT or something crazy like that. So a little bit resistant at first, but then they wrote to Dr. Peter Duisberg, and he wrote back and he basically said, AZT is incompatible with life, stop the drug right away. So they did stop the drug, and all these illnesses of the child went away. And when I was at the Rethinking AIDS 2009 conference, Lindsay Nagel was there. She was 19 years old at that time, and was a perfectly
I saw
healthy,
a picture. Yeah, she's a beautiful woman.
Beautiful young woman, a little small. Maybe the AZT had stunted her growth somewhat. 2 years of AZT is a lot. And tragically, a couple years later, like I guess 2012 or 2013, she herself became pregnant and got into this battle royal with the doctors, where they forced her to give drugs to the child. I mean, they went to the point where every day she would have to go on Skype, and she would have to show the doctors that she was giving the drug to the infant. Or if she didn't do that, they would take the baby away from her. I mean, this in a supposed democracy, a drug that says on its very label that this drug can cause AIDS, is forced on mothers and their infants. It's just crazy.
And that's because she was diagnosed.
That's because the mother was HIV positive.
Yeah.
And they don't have accurate...
Is AZT still the drug they're giving to the infants?
There's only two drugs that I know of that are being given to infants, AZT and nevirapine, and nevirapine's never been approved in the United States. So basically AZT is the only game in town. And it's forced on women, law or no law, because basically the American legal system says that an expert is allowed to give their opinion in court. So if there's a dispute over an infant, they bring in a doctor who's considered an expert, and they say, will this child die if they don't get AZT? And the doctor says, yes, in my opinion, the child will die if the child doesn't get AZT. And then the judge is basically forced to follow that. That becomes a fact, the statement of a doctor. And this sort of fascist state of allopathic medicine has been elevated once more just last Friday, when the CDC released a new standard for defining HIV infection. And one of the definitions of HIV infection is if a doctor says that he thinks you are HIV infected with absolutely no evidence. In fact, it says, in the absence of any known laboratory evidence, if a doctor thinks you are HIV infected and gets one symptom of AIDS or a low CD4 count or something like that, that constitutes a valid definition of HIV infection. So if a doctor doesn't like you, if he thinks that you're a gay man, or he thinks you're a promiscuous black man, or he thinks something else about you, and he writes on a piece of paper, I think my patient is HIV positive, and then persuades you to do a few blood tests, and if one of those comes back positive for, say, a low CD4 count, or maybe you have a minor fungal infection or something like that, then you have a definition of HIV infection. And what that can mean is if you're HIV infected and you have sex with a partner without telling them you're HIV infected, you can be sent to jail for many years.
So that is the type of diagnosis that they've been doing in Africa all along.
Well, it's even
where they would
more
just
bizarre
look for
than
symptoms
in Africa.
Well, yeah, they could have an agenda now, but I mean, if they can do it just by looking at you, that's pretty much what they were doing in Africa without any kind of a test.
Yeah, I mean, it's scary because most doctors are not going to sort of bring you into your office and say, I think you've got an HIV infection. I mean, most doctors are more sane and more humane than that. But it's kind of like the America now has the right, apparently, to assassinate American citizens with a drone. Now, there's really no difference between assassinating an American citizen in Yemen and assassinating one in downtown New York City. but we can imagine that, they're probably not going to fire a drone at somebody in New York. But that's only because they decide they don't want to do it. They seem to have the legal right to do it. So a doctor now, if a doctor thinks that, maybe he decides moralistically that he thinks you're too promiscuous, he can say, I think you're HIV infected. And he runs a full slate of blood tests. He's probably going to get one back that says, oh, this person's positive for tuberculosis, or this person is got a low CD4 count or something, and then you're trapped. You now have a diagnosis of HIV infection, and the rest of your life you're going to be carrying around this burden, including control
how about
over your sexuality.
How about if he screws up my operation and I assume for malpractice, then all of a sudden I'll be HIV positive, right?
Well, yeah, and if he can persuade you to go on the drugs, he can get rid of you pretty quickly. So before your lawsuit goes anywhere, you're going to be an AIDS victim, So,
Chief, you had a question? I'm sorry. I think I interrupted Chief before.
Yeah.
There's no way you can fight it in the court of law, then.
Well, the odds are stacked against you. There have been people who have won. There was a famous case in Maine many years ago where a woman was allowed to take her child off AZT because the judge said, she had 2 children and one of them was on AZT longer and that child died, so I'm going to allow you to take your second child off AZT because there's no reason why you should have to lose 2 children. But the average in court is really very much against us, and that's, I think, because the American legal system sort of elevates experts, and MDs are by definition experts, to this position where they cannot really be questioned. And if a doctor stands up in court and says something, unless you can get another doctor on the other side to say the opposite, what that doctor says will stand.
I guess that goes into my next question about the doctors themselves. Don't they know this information?
Well, the medical system is extremely hierarchical, and so they're under a lot of pressure to follow standard practice and to believe standard viewpoints. And they see what happens to doctors who go against the mainstream. They lose their license. They get trumped-up charges against them. All kinds of bad things can happen. So most doctors become very conformist because it's a lot easier to work that way. You don't rock the boat and you don't get into trouble and you make quite a lot of money and life's not bad. And there are only relatively few doctors who have bucked the system and said, I'm not going to stand for this. Like one man I know who's a doctor in the Washington, D.C. area, he deliberately does not take insurance in his practice because he knows that if he takes insurance, he's going to get all kinds of grief from the insurance companies about how he treats HIV-positive people or how he treats mentally ill people. If he doesn't follow the standard practice, the insurance companies are going to say, we're not going to pay for that because what you're supposed to do is put this person on ARVs or you're supposed to put them on antidepressants or something like that.
Yeah.
So it's a lot easier for him if he says, you come to see me, you pay cash, basically. And so he's basically opted out of the medical system. Pardon me?
It's a type of defensive medicine.
Yes, I thought...
It fits under the larger umbrella of defensive medicine.
Yeah, I didn't until recently know what defensive medicine was. I thought it was something like preventive medicine, but what defensive medicine is doing medicine so that you don't get sued. And
That's
so,
right.
For example, everybody knows, doctors know that the PSA test for prostate cancer is totally useless and just results in a large number of false positives. I mean, maybe not everybody knows, but they should. It's well documented that it does. But doctors will still recommend a PSA test because it's kind of state-of-the-art. And if you don't recommend a PSA test and one of your patients comes down with prostate cancer and they go through the records and they say, you never issued a PSA test, then you're screwed. And so it's easier to issue the PSA test, have people unnecessarily treated for cancer that's not really there or is never going to cause any problems in your lifetime, than it is to have an adult conversation and say, I could recommend the PSA test, but I think it's a lousy test, but you're going to have to sign this piece of paper to say that we discussed it and you agreed not to have it. Because without that, I could get sued if you later come down with prostate cancer.
Okay, we talked about various groups that are being targeted and coerced into taking HIV tests. We mentioned youth, we mentioned gay men, pregnant women, and another group is African Americans.
Yes.
Talk to us a little bit about that and why you think they may have been targeted. Because I remember when I read Peter Duesberg's book, he had hypothesized that Africans may have something that tests positive endogenously as part of their DNA, and it has nothing to do with HIV or any other virus. Just
right.
You know, it was there way before the epidemic. It was there 100 years ago, 200 years ago.
Yeah, because, I mean, the flaw in the logic was that they took a few people who were very sick. You know, I think it was probably mostly gay men from Los Angeles, New York, Miami, places like that. And they said, look, these gay men have antibodies that we don't normally find in the general population. And so from that, they postulated that those antibodies in the general population would be indicative of the presence of this deadly virus. So they turned around and started testing in Africa, and they started getting a whole bunch of people testing positive. They tried it in other places, and it didn't work so well. They tried it in India, and they didn't really have very good results. And eventually, when the Indian government realized that they were basically trying to pump up the numbers in India to make it look like there was an epidemic, the Indians basically revolted and said, look, you know, you can't make up cases. There just aren't any cases of HIV in India, and maybe it's because the Indian genome is slightly different than in Africa and less likely to test false positive. So we don't really know why it was, but it created, blacks as a target group, and it kind of fits into the white belief, the white fear of African American male sexuality. I mean, that is a current within American history. Whites have always been fearful of black male sexuality, and this is kind of proof. You know, if there's so many more of them who are HIV positive, then they must be more promiscuous. But any survey that's done of black sexualities finds that blacks and whites are pretty similar in their sexuality and their level of promiscuity. And in fact, many African societies are very conservative. And yet you have this high rate of HIV positivity in Africa. And as Henry Bauer says, you've got two choices. You either believe that blacks are incredibly promiscuous, or you believe that there's something wrong with the HIV/AIDS theory.
But, well, there's definitely something wrong with the HIV/AIDS theory.
Yeah, I think so.
I mean, I would argue that there is no positive that is not a false positive.
Well,
because if the positive is for a virus that has not even been isolated or proven to exist, it's a positive to something. It's a positive to some protein. We don't know if the protein came from a virus or it's some cellular debris or what it is. And they can't prove that it came from the virus.
One of the proteins
and
on the... Yeah,
even if it did come from... Well, let me take it a step further. Even if it did come from the virus, they haven't shown that the virus causes any disease. So you're several steps. You got big leaps of faith there before you go to what is considered to be the official line that HIV causes AIDS. I just found out when I was preparing for this show that the hip-hop community has also been targeted, and especially in Texas, where in Houston and Dallas they've been bringing in people by the hundreds and giving them free concert tickets to get them tested. And then after they get tested, they counsel them and tell them that if they're positive, they should be taking drugs.
Well, they're not really free concert tickets because you can't get the concert tickets unless you get tested. So you line up, and after you're tested, they give you the tickets. Right.
And in fact, in Houston, they claimed that they had, in one year, there were 15,000 people tested just for one event. Not at the same. They would set up locations in different places, and they'd have a couple of hundred tickets here and 100 tickets there, and they would get all these people to get tested and give them concert tickets. And I'm sure that when they got tested, they didn't realize what they were getting into.
Well, I can just sort of see this scenario where you have to get your test results back before you got the tickets, if I read it correctly. And so it would be a counselor sitting there saying, well, there's good news and there's bad news. The good news is here's your concert tickets. The bad news is you have a fatal virus and you're going to die. But have a nice concert. Enjoy the show, as they say.
And more good news, you can take drugs for the rest of your life.
Yeah, come back after the show and we'll put you on toxic antiretroviral therapies that might knock out your liver or your kidney. But, just don't worry about it for 2 hours while you enjoy the show, and then come back and let your life fall apart later.
No, it's really criminal. And yet there are some African Americans who have questioned the HIV theory. Could you mention a few? I know one is Lee Evans from the 1968 Olympics, one of the athletes that did the Black Power salute.
Yes, I wasn't really prepared for that question. There's a talk show host in Los Angeles, Kadia Awadu, who's done a lot of shows on AIDS. There are definitely people in every community who have done this. But going against the current doesn't bring it with it money, and I think who are more influential are the people in every community who are willing to sell out their brothers and sisters in order to turn a profit. And this has been a sad reality in the gay community, where these AIDS organizations are run by very influential gay men who've made a ton of money stampeding their fellow gay men onto drugs. And the same thing has happened in the black community. People like Magic Johnson, who's opened, a chain of HIV testing clinics and who's shilled for 2 different AIDS drugs. There's obviously money involved, and there are some people who would sell their grandmother if the price was good enough.
Duesberg has questioned whether Magic Johnson even actually took the therapy. Do you have any opinion on that?
Yeah, there's a saying that there's no magic in AZT and there's no AZT in magic. That was a saying back then. It's very difficult to tell. We know that compliance to AIDS drugs is quite low, and it's also very, very difficult to measure it. The only way to really know if people are compliant to their drugs is something called directly observed therapy, which basically means you throw somebody in prison, and every 4 hours you bring them out of their cell, you force them to take the drugs, and then you send them back after they've swallowed the drugs. Apart from that, there's a very good book on AIDS and the legal system, and there's a quote that I always remember that says that most people lie to their doctors, and most doctors don't know this. And so if you go in front of your doctor and the doctor says, have you taken every dose of your Truvada over the last month? It's very important that you don't miss a single dose. I mean, most people under those circumstances will say, yes, doctor, I took every dose. And they will lie, and maybe they haven't taken any. You don't know. And so doctors come up with this belief that their patients are compliant because they're asking them, and their patients are saying yes. But their doctors also don't tolerate dissent. So if somebody says, well, I started throwing up, I got diarrhea, I just felt crappy every day, so I stopped. You're going to get a real lecture from your doctor, and patients know this, so to avoid the lecture, they say what the doctor wants to hear. Yes, I took every dose. And so it's very difficult, and especially when Magic Johnson was making money by pushing AIDS drugs, he knew that his contract would come to an end if he said, well, I sell AIDS drugs to other people, but personally, they just made me sick, so I stopped. So we have no idea of whether he was taking the drugs or not.
Well, the one idea we have is he's still alive and healthy, so that probably means he didn't take them.
Yeah, I mean, AZT, just anybody who thinks about biology would understand that a drug that interferes with DNA synthesis is not going to let you live that long.
It's a cytotoxic drug, and if you take it long term, which everybody is supposed to, you're gone.
Yeah,
it wasn't even approved for cancer therapy, which is usually given in short spurts where you get a chance to recuperate. Right. And with AZT, for AIDS, it's a continuous thing from until you finally succumb.
Yeah, there's a classic book called AZT, Poison by Prescription, which was written by a gay man, John Lauritsen, who was also an anti-paupers activist, and he wrote articles for a journal, a gay sort of magazine back in the 80s, and he put these articles into a book, and he described how corrupt the original AZT trials were. But once they got AZT approved, then they could test all future AIDS drugs against AZT. So taking this incredibly toxic drug, you could make anything looking good by testing it against AZT. But he documented how all kinds of tricks were done. So if somebody started to get sick, they would move them to the placebo arm of the trial, to the people who were not taking AZT. And so then that person would die, and they would be counted as a death in the placebo arm. Gay men taking the drugs, not all gay men, but probably a lot of gay men taking the drugs, would pool their drugs because they knew that some were placebos, some were AZT. And so they would mix them all together, and they would all share them, and so then everybody got some AZT. In other cases, people would learn that if the drug made you feel sick, it was AZT. And since they really believed in the drug, they wanted to take the drug that made them feel sick. So if they had a buddy who said, I take this and nothing happens to me, well, you must be taking the placebo, so I'll give you half of my AZT. That kind of thing happened. So there's a lot of corruption and also wishful thinking amongst the participants in the trial.
Well, this has been an eye-opener, I hope, for many, and we want to thank you for being on the show. 30 years of HIV mythology. Not an easy topic to cover.
It's a big topic, and thank you for having me. And I hope people learned a lot from this.
Our guest has been David Crowe, president of Rethinking AIDS. And for people that are interested, the website is www.rethinkingaids.com.
That's correct.
Okay, and we also have a Facebook group
called Rethinking AIDS.
And that has over 4,000 members now.
Yes, there's a lot of people, and there's also Rethinking AIDS groups for other countries as well, and other languages. So people can contact us on that list, and we can get you on the right Rethinking AIDS group.
Thank you very much. And this is Richard Jannaccio with Chief 69. You've been listening to a special interview with David Crowe, president of Rethinking AIDS. And our topic, a look at the facts regarding HIV, AIDS, testing, treatment, and more. Thank you for listening.